nobody had anticipated the news that woke the world up. The wife of David Phelps had formally filed for divorce. They had been viewed for years as the ideal pair, the kind of romance that everyone hoped for and appreciated. Moments of affection, collaboration, and unflinching support for one another have characterized their public relationship. However, the fundamental basis of that ostensibly indestructible link had suddenly fallen apart. The story was quickly picked up by the media, and it quickly rose to the top of the entertainment news sites' headlines. Fans couldn't understand how such a solid marriage could abruptly fail, leaving them in disbelief. There was an abundance of queries, conjectures, and theories on social media. Others questioned whether there had been turmoil simmering behind the scenes for a while others thought it was just another unfounded rumor. However, one thing was evident. This was more than mere rumors. It was authentic. Conflicting narratives started to emerge as additional reports surfaced. While some insiders implied that their relationship had been strained by David's demanding profession, others alluded to personal issues that had been developing over time. But neither David nor his wife made an official remark. Both sides' silence only served to deepen the mystery and pique people's interest in what had actually transpired. When reporters approached the couple's close acquaintances, they either refused to talk or just expressed their sadness over the circumstances. The public's fascination was only heightened by the ambiguity. Online forums were used by the couple's supporters to discuss every aspect of their previous encounters in an effort to find hints as to why their marriage had devolved to this degree. One question remained once the immediate shock had subsided. Did David Phelps' romance really come to an end? Or was there more to the tale than was generally understood? It appeared to be the ideal marriage. For a long time, David Phelps and his spouse were regarded as the ideal pair. Their love affair appeared like something out of a fairy tale from the first minute they met. Everyone who's seen them together could see their unmistakable connection. They were obviously in love, as seen by their public appearances, sincere social media posts, and interview comments about one another. Their shared experience was motivational. They had created a life that people looked up to, supporting one another through every hardship and significant event. There was more to David's wife than merely a romantic connection. She was his greatest ally, his confidant, and the person who stood with him through all of his triumphs and setbacks. She continued to be his rock, making sure that their home was warm and loving despite the demands of his job. They frequently posted intimate images, meaningful remarks, candid views into their personal lives, and fleeting moments of joy on social media. In a world where partnerships frequently broke down under stress, fans cherished their closeness as evidence that pure love still existed. Their romance was celebrated rather than merely admired. They were praised by friends and relatives, who frequently described their bond as unshakable. They were the type of pair that understood one another without using words, who completed each other's sentences. Nobody could have foreseen that something was slowly beginning to break behind this flawless image. But as time went on, things started to shift. Almost imperceptibly at first, what had seemed effortless started to need work. There were fewer and fewer times of connection and laughter. The once strong love was now dealing with difficulties none of them had anticipated. The world was silently ignoring what had previously seemed to be an unbreakable love tale until it was too late. The initial indications of disaster, even those closest to Phelps were first unaware of the slight alterations in their marriage. Everything appeared to be as ideal as ever to the outer world. They continued to smile in their social media posts. They continued to speak kindly of one another and to appear elegant in public. However, their relationship's basis had begun to erode behind the scenes. Little things were the first. Despite his hectic work schedule, David had always made time for his wife a priority, but he began to grow more aloof. His schedule grew increasingly hectic, and his work obligations increased. His wife initially understood. She had always stood by his side while he developed his career and encouraged him to pursue his goals. But gradually, the comprehension gave way to loneliness. The number of late-night studio sessions increased. Once brimming with passion and warmth, their interactions became more ordinary and shorter. Their dinner together devolved into rushed dinners or quiet times when they were each absorbed in their own thoughts. Though nothing was verified, rumors started to circulate. Some conjectured that David's marriage was no longer possible because his job had taken over his life. Others mumbled about private hardships, things that had been kept out of the public view. However, it was evident that something had changed. A marriage based on love and cooperation was now gradually disintegrating. and they both felt it, even though neither of them wanted to acknowledge it. The initial fissures had already emerged, and it would not be long until they were unavoidable. The tipping point. No marriage ends abruptly. The gradual disintegration had been occurring for months, if not years, for David Phelps and his spouse. However, every tense relationship has its moments. The one time when everything that has been suppressed finally explodes. That moment was unexpected for them. It had been brewing all along, though, in retrospect. It began as any other night would. David had just gotten home from yet another exhausting day of back-to-back commitments, rehearsals, and meetings. As she always did, his wife had been waiting for the chance to finally engage in a genuine conversation, free from distracted nods and work calls. For too long, she had felt cut off from him, and she was unable to ignore it tonight. "Can we talk?" she asked him. David, however, was so worn out from his day that he hardly looked up from his phone. He said, "Can we do this later?" The last straw was that unthinking, thoughtless sentence. "Later," she said it again in a low but irritated voice. "What time is later, David? Because it seems to never arrive." He put his phone down and sighed. "What should I say? In your opinion? Here, I'm giving it my all. My actions are always done with our future in mind. However, what about right now?" Her voice broke as she asked, "How about me? At what point did I cease to be a priority?" For years, the tension in the room grew. She had waited. She had sensed his enthusiasm for his job. She had come to terms with the silent loneliness, the canceled plans, and the late nights that came with being the wife of a person who was often in the news. However, understanding had eventually given way to sacrifice. It wasn't until she felt totally alone that she realized she was making one. With a look of frustration on his face, David combed through his hair. "When we were married, you were aware of my life. You stood beside me. You supported me. What was different?" Tears welled up in her eyes. "I evolved. I grew up, David. I came to understand that love is more than simply supporting someone. Walking together is the goal. And we stopped doing that sometime along the line." There was silence between them. David felt in his heart that she was correct. He had lost sight of the important times because he was too preoccupied with pursuing achievement and ensuring their future. He had assumed she would always be there, always understanding, always waiting, and he had taken her love for granted. But he saw the reality tonight. She was worn out. "I'm sick of being an afterthought and sick of clinging to something that seems biased." Then she whispered the words that neither of them had previously dared to say, in a voice so low it was practically a whisper. "I don't believe I'm capable of doing this anymore." Suddenly, everything was different. The quiet battles that take place behind closed doors. Everything was different after that night. David and his wife's conversations grew shorter, their conversations more chilly. Silence had taken the place of the warmth that had once pervaded their house. Long, agonizing silences that were more powerful than words. David made an effort to act as though nothing was wrong. He immersed himself in his task, believing that the stress would ultimately subside if he simply persisted. But he knew the truth in his heart. He had no idea how to mend the rift that had formed between them. By contrast, his wife had given up acting. She had battled for years to keep their marriage intact, constantly coming up with reasons for his absence and persuading herself that things would improve. Now, however, she had no more grounds for optimism. Like a supporting character in her own life, she felt invisible. Most of the time, she would wake up to a bed that was empty, the room next to her cold from another night. It was late when David returned home. She would eat by herself at the dinner table, even though he quickly apologized via text message for being preoccupied with work. The issue went beyond his hectic schedule. It had to do with how he still felt so far away even when he was at home. Every chat she had with him ended in frustration. He would tell her she was over-analyzing when she expressed her emotions. He would say he would attempt to spend more time with her, but nothing ever changed. She eventually stopped inquiring. She no longer waited for things to improve. Knowing that David wasn't a bad person was the most difficult thing. He wasn't mean. He wasn't cheating. He wasn't trying to harm her. However, love is more than just avoiding errors. The important thing is to try. And he had ceased that endeavor somewhere along the line. Friends started noticing how she had changed. She avoided discussing their marriage at all, spoke less about David, and smiled less. She would pretend to grin when someone asked her how she was feeling and respond, "Yeah, we're just busy these days." On the inside, though, she felt as though she were drowning. She began to doubt everything. Had her decision to marry him been a mistake? Had she invested too much of herself in an unsustainable love affair? Or worse, she would have been the last one remaining if David had quit loving her. She had come to the realization that she already knew the answer every night as she lay awake and stared at the ceiling. She simply wasn't prepared to acknowledge it just yet, but she would have to shortly. The choice to initiate divorce proceedings. It had finally come, the moment she had long feared. Between her emotions and her reality, David's wife has been engaged in an internal conflict for months, in the hopes that perhaps, just possibly, things would return to how they were. A part of her continued to cling to the love they had previously shared. However, the other side of her, the side that had been lonely for too many nights in a pretended partnership of a marriage, recognized the reality. This was no longer love, at least not the type that gave her a sense of security, worth, and visibility. She finally made up her mind one evening while sitting by herself in their peaceful house. She could no longer handle the weight on her chest. She also realized she wasn't depressed for the first time in a long time. She was worn out, fed up with battling for something that didn't feel like her own anymore. Divorce wasn't an easy decision, but it was the only one she had left after growing weary of feeling alienated in her own relationship. She called early the following morning. As she talked to the lawyer, her hands shook. Saying the words out made everything seem real, even if her heart was pounding and her voice was steady. There was no going back. Now, David didn't respond right away when he heard the news. He initially believed it to be an error or miscommunication. Perhaps she was merely attempting to intimidate him into making amends. However, the truth struck him like a kick to the belly when he viewed the official documents. He was numb. He had promised her forever, and this was his wife. The woman who had supported him through it all was now heading out. David had to face the truth of what had transpired for the first time in a long time. He had neglected to take care of his marriage, which was the most essential aspect of his life, since he was preoccupied with his career, his objectives, and his future, and it was slipping out of his grasp now. However, it was too late. Within hours, the news reached the media, and rumors went viral online. All of the main entertainment websites displayed headlines. The wife of David Phelps applies for divorce. What went wrong? Supporters were split. Others conjectured that there was more to the story than was widely known, while others accused David of putting his work before his wife. David and his wife said nothing in spite of the commotion. Quiet acceptance was the norm. There were no dramatic interviews or public declarations. Now that she had made her decision, she only needed to proceed. The rumors and the headlines weren't the hardest part. Knowing that they had once been everything to one another was the most difficult aspect. And now they were only a recollection. The public's response and the aftermath. The world responded in the only way it knew how when the divorce news was announced. Quite loudly, social media exploded with astonishment, incredulity, and unending conjecture. Fans who had spent years following David and his wife's romance were devastated and found it difficult to comprehend how their seemingly ideal marriage had ended. Some people didn't think it was true, dismissing it as a rumor or a marketing gimmick. Others came to terms with the hard truth. No matter how lovely, love stories don't always last. News organizations focused on entertainment quickly covered all aspects of the story. According to some stories, David's demanding profession was the primary cause of the long-brewing breakup. Others hypothesized that there had been more intense, private conflicts behind the scenes. However, only the two individuals involved knew the reality. David and his spouse decided to keep quiet in spite of the media hysteria. There were no public declarations, interviews, or tirades on social media. No headline could ever adequately convey the impact of their silence. However, this did not prevent the world from creating its own story. David's supporters vigorously defended him, claiming that his marriage's breakdown was not due to his commitment to his work. He had put a lot of effort into his dreams. For that, why should he be punished? A fan posted a tweet. Others, on the other hand, agreed with his wife, stating that no amount of achievement should be worth sacrificing for the sake of your loved ones. As old videos, interviews, and social media accounts were examined for hints, the divine among fans rose. Were there indications from the start? Had no one noticed that their love had been failing for years? Every little thing was examined. Each moment in the past became a hint as to what had gone wrong. However, the public's response wasn't the largest obstacle for David and his spouse. It was the private, silent agony of letting go. David found it difficult to accept the new situation. His house, which had been vibrant, felt empty, the loss of her warmth, her presence, and her voice. No amount of labor or music could satisfy that emptiness. In an attempt to find a moment that would explain how they had gone from everything to nothing, he found himself going through old pictures and reading old texts again. His wife had her own problems as well. She had decided to leave, but that didn't mean it was simple. It hurt to leave behind years of love, memories, and dreams shared. But because she had finally decided to love herself more, rather than because she no longer loved him, she realized she had to do it. One thing became evident as the dust settled. Life would continue. The world would go on to the next great story, the headlines would fade, and the talk would stop. However, the wounds from their love tale will always be there, engraved in David and his wife's hearts as a reminder of the past and what was never again possible. Onward, a new chapter starts. The world gradually recovered from the devastating revelation of David Phelps' divorce as the weeks went by. Fresher scandals, new celebrity stories, and the never-ending cycle of public interest shifting elsewhere have supplanted the headlines that formerly dominated entertainment news. However, moving on was a far more complicated reality for David and his wife. David found it more difficult than he had anticipated to adapt to life without her. He continued to have a rigorous profession, but success didn't feel as satisfying for the first time in years. Now, the house they had constructed together seemed too large and too silent. Instinctively, he reached for his phone to share something with her, but then he remembered that she was no longer there. He had no choice but to confront the overwhelming loneliness. Even music, which had always been his escape, was strange today. He appeared to be reminded of what he had lost by every song and line. He would sit at his piano some evenings with his fingers resting on the keys, but no tune would emerge. He had always thought that anything could be healed by music. But might this be healed? In contrast, his wife was learning how to start over in a new way. Even though she had made the decision to go, it wasn't easy to start anew. Her identity had been entwined with David's, his profession, his aspirations, and their shared life for years. Beyond that, she needed to discover who she was. She put all of her energy into finding the things that brought her joy again. She resumed her long-abandoned interests, traveled, and reconnected with old acquaintances. She reminded herself every day that recovery wasn't a simple process. There were days when she felt liberated and days when she was saddened by the love she had lost. Even though they stopped communicating, they shared the unspoken knowledge that love alone isn't always sufficient to keep a marriage intact. The past would always be a part of their tale, the world would continue to conjecture, and fans would continue to argue. But David and his wife understood that the only way to move ahead was to embrace the future, even if it meant doing so independently. So they did. With a fresh outlook, David went back to his songwriting, directing his feelings into the songs that would eventually provide his version of events. When his wife realized that the conclusion of one chapter was only the start of another, she found strength in her independence. Their romantic relationship had not ended as they had hoped. Perhaps, however, it had ended just as it should have. Love and loss teach us valuable lessons. The hurt of their parting lessened over time. Although the wounds didn't entirely go away, they got easier to deal with. David and his wife have discovered that forgetting was not the solution to healing. Accepting, developing, and moving forward with the lessons life had taught them was the goal. The most important lesson for David was that he wishes he had discovered it sooner. Big gestures and promises of eternity aren't the only aspects of love. It has to do with presence.